Good morning. My name is not Donna Brazil, and I am sorry to report that Donna cannot make it here this morning. Her day job interfered as a commentator on CNN. She is now preparing to do the preview of the Senator Obama's speech this morning on religion, and then the post-commentary on it, and she learned about her assignment last night, so I'm a substitute. But it is a pleasure to be able to introduce this discussion. We're going to talk this morning about progressives in a time when liberal allies are in power. And our case study is King during the Kennedy and Johnson years. As you know, earlier in the presidential race, there was a flap about this, about the role of King in creating change in the civil rights movement, and that it took a president to get those laws done. And it became part of the exchange between the two candidates. But we actually thought it was a serious matter of great importance to us today, which is, as we've seen over the last 2 years when we had Democrats take the majority of the House with the most liberal House Speaker in our history, and Democrats with a slim majority in the Senate, when you have allies in power and you're trying to push them to do more, the tensions between those who are your allies and those who are an independent progressive movement pushing for change are quite difficult to navigate. And so we thought it would be really interesting to try to go back and look at the King-Johnson years with some care about what it felt like and what the strategies were for King and the movement, what it felt like from inside the administration and the strategies of the administration in relationship to the movement, and to give us an overview of this period and then try to draw some conclusions about what it means for today. And we have this extraordinary group of people to talk about it. I can't think of a better panel on it. And I'm going to introduce them all first, and then I'm going to ask them each to speak, and then we'll have an exchange if we can, and then we'll ask them each to make some concluding remarks. Reverend Jesse Jackson doesn't really need an introduction. You all know him. He is the head of the Rainbow Push Coalition. 20 years ago, I had the pleasure of working as his issue advisors in the Jackson 88 campaign, which was really an extraordinary and transformative campaign that developed the theme about how we can build, we can move from racial battlegrounds into economic common ground. And it was a great privilege to learn an enormous amount from him. And in many ways, the Campaign for America's Future and its philosophy came out of that campaign over the years. Reverend Jackson was, of course, as a very young man, at King's side in the civil rights movement, and so saw up close how Dr. King was dealing with the pressures of a movement pushing for justice, allies in the administration that he wanted to do a lot more than they thought they could do. Roger Wilkins is the chairman of the board of the Institute for America's Future. He's my closest friend. He is a former professor or just recently retired professor from George Mason University. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner for his editorials during the Watergate era. During the King years, as a very young man, he was an assistant attorney general. And he was one of the highest ranking African Americans inside the Johnson administration, trying to get things done from the inside and dealing with the pressures of the movement on the outside. So he has the perspective to be able to tell us and talk to us from what it felt like, in a sense, at Johnson's side. And then Taylor Branch and I go back to when we were striplings out of college, and Taylor is has really done a magisterial life work by his books on the King years, the 3-volume set, Pulitzer Prize winning, which really probed an era and took an incredible insight about not simply the view from the top, but the view from the organizers on the ground, the energy that was created, the people leaving their normal lives and joining a movement and taking enormous risks to create change. And so he has a kind of overview. And in his last volume, which I recommend highly, he, to me anyway, reading it, he revealed to me how much of a hero Johnson was in some senses in this, much more than I had ever thought. And so there was a sense of the perspective both from the ground and from the Oval Office. So what I'm going to ask is for each of them to start for 10 minutes each and give their perspective. Then we'll have a little exchange and then a conclusion. Reverend Jackson.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Let me express my sincere thanks to Bob Borisov for his steadfast leadership as a scholar, writer, and activist, and for people who work as Bob worked so effectively, so successfully, so determined to build a coalition of conscience. We can never take Bob Borisov's work for granted, and while he is among us, let's give Bob a big hand. Bob, we thank you so much. Put your hands together. As I tried to grapple with Bob, recommended that I share today, being here with Roger, my mentor, I'm a bit intimidated. Taylor Branch might write another chapter, so I don't quite know which way to go. The tensions, the creative tensions between the prophetic tradition and the political tradition, even when there are warm feelings. The story is often told by Belafonte that A. Philip Randolph and a group of leaders met with Franklin D. Roosevelt, with whom they found great favor. But the same Roosevelt with whom they found great favor required the threat of a march on Washington in 1941 to move the agenda forward. On another occasion, a group of the leaders met with Roosevelt and laid out the case for a workers' rights, civil rights agenda. Roosevelt said, "I heard everything you said, and I believe everything you said. Now go out and make me do it." It was a cry for an independent movement to have set the climate of the agenda where even political allies, given their constraints, have different choices. The worst thing that can happen to any administration is lack of activity by independents on matters of justice and inclusion. Dr. King put it another way often. He said that vanity asked the question, is it popular? We want to be popular, to be accepted. It asked the question, is it popular? And politics asks the question, will it work? Can I win with the trade-offs? And conscience and morality asks, is it right? And in time it may be neither popular nor politic, but is it right is the haunting question. And often the is it right question is what runs the prophetic change tradition with the political tradition. So I'm making a case here for a kind of third rail, an independent rail. It's during the period of slavery, the conservatives said we must honor the law and we do with them as we will please to do with them. If we want to give harsh treatment, that's our right to do so. And the liberals said, don't treat them harshly, be humane toward them. The abolitionists said, end the whole system. Some distinction between treat them harshly, treat them kindly, free them, and treat them as human beings. There's third rail. And during that season, as Lincoln vacillated with the question of Emancipation Proclamation, you see him going to and forth, wrestling with his political options or alternatives. You hear that Frederick Douglass is crying out, demanding that he go to moral higher ground. And so it is that in the struggle to end slavery, women's suffrage, labor's right to organize, civil rights, there's this tension between independent change agents and political status quo, even when good guys are in power. Let us not forget when the Montgomery bus boycott started in 1955, neither party embraced it. It was not funded by any party. The Montgomery bus boycott was an independent political movement. As it evolved with the 63 March on Washington, John Kennedy was against the march, but really could not be hostile toward it, but because it added pressure, it forced him to make decisions he really did not want to make. Our movement in Birmingham, in some sense, gave Kennedy a chance to choose between King and Bull Connor. To his credit, he chose King over Bull Connor, but our independent action forced those choices upon him. But even during that season with the Kennedys, no one unleashed more telephone taps on us than Robert Kennedy. This combination of fighting for change as an independent and protecting one's political turf. Dr. King received a Nobel Peace Prize. I suppose Mount Roger was 6-4, and they gave him a big White House reception. Mr. Johnson did. He said, "Thank you very much, but we need the right to vote." And Mr. Johnson said, in effect, "You know, I like you very much, but I can't grant you the right to vote. And if we do it, we'll lose the South for another 25 years. And so it was not in that meeting that the Voting Rights Act came. It was in the Independent Bloody March in Selma, Alabama. It was the third rail. I say in closing that in Chicago, in our elevator system, our train system, there's something called the third rail. There's track A, there's track B. But unless the third rail, where the energy is, where the power is, where the fire is, unless the third rail is turned on, the train never moves. And that's the role of independence, being a source of conscience, a source of change, a source of idealism, a source of raising the moral chin bar. And I would like to say Dr. King lastly argued that we had won against the laws of indecency, where you just couldn't use the toilet, you couldn't drink water at the fountain, you counterfeited our money, we couldn't buy ice cream at Howard Johnson, couldn't stay at Holiday Inn. We won the laws against indecency, governors blocking doors, humiliating us. But he said, but beyond indecency and beyond barbarism, there's something called economic justice, and that involves a much broader agenda, and thus to organizing of end the war, because money is going to the war in Vietnam, should be going to war on poverty at home, training them into a head-on conflict with the Johnson administration, who was executing the war. And we were on our way to Washington to engage in civil disobedience and go to jail to force the issue of end the war as well as revive a war on poverty. I close on the note, and I said to some people here yesterday, we who are in the struggle must not forget just how successful we were in pulling down the cotton curtain and transforming America. You couldn't have had the Dallas Cowboys, the Atlanta Falcons behind the cotton curtain. You couldn't have had the Olympics behind the cotton curtain. You couldn't have had all this international investment behind the cotton curtain, all these integrated basketball teams in March Madness behind the cotton curtain. We won that battle, and we won it. And we won it with coalition. This weak 43 years ago, we were marching for the right to vote, justice. And to see Hillary and Barack 43 years later as the conduits through which a new and more mature America is expressing itself. These are the fruits of our labors, of whatever those internal battles were. And sometimes it takes some seeds longer to germinate than others. And I say to each of you today, come Selma next year, don't let that be seen as a for blacks only march in Selma. Selma transformed America, and Selma redefined democracy for the whole world. In that blacks got the right to vote in 65, yes, but 18-year-olds out of that got the right to vote in 1970. This whole new youth vote, that comes out of Selma too. In 74, a suit was filed in the Delta of Mississippi. You could have voting residency on your campus, and so you can vote where you go to school. That came out of Selma too. And by 75, bilingual voting, whether you're Hispanic or Native American or Eastern European, that came out of Selma too. The Physical Disabilities Act of 1990, so you could vote in Braille or have wheelchair accessibility, that came out of Selma too. Even affirmative action, which is majority not minority for women and people of color, 7 and 9 titles, that came out of Selma too. EEOC and contract compliance, that came out of Selma too. So in the end, the prophetic urge, the urgency of now, the imperative for change, the risk for change, putting pressure on the political system, today we reap the benefits of those struggles. Thank you very much.
Reverend Jackson, I'll tell you something else that came out of Selma. Do you remember in one of your first meetings in Washington in the campaign of 1984, I came to the meeting with a little girl, about this big. Well, that little girl now is a college graduate. She's 24 years old. She came to me about a year ago, and she said, "Daddy, I've got this good job with this labor union." She said, "But the Obama campaign has asked me to come in and work for it. What do you think?" You know what I said to her? I said, "Kid, this is your generation Selma. You dare not miss it." And she did good in South Carolina, and she did good in Baltimore, and then came Ohio. But now she's in Philadelphia, and it's going to be all right. The civil rights movement, in essence, defined my whole career in the federal government from 1962 to 1969. It defined it because the power of the movement and the risks that the young people were taking made it impossible for me to continue to be a lawyer in New York with nothing to do with the uplift of the world. And so I went to work for the Kennedy administration in foreign aid. And I did that for 2 years, but as the movement became stronger and the risks that the demonstrators were taking in the South made me ask myself, well, what are you doing? These people are risking their lives. Are you going to just pursue a middle-class life, the comforts of it, or are you going to do things? Well, unfortunately, the Kennedy administration had a posture that made it possible, almost imperative, for me to do both. There were not, in 1962 and 63, a whole lot of black people in the federal government. And I was the only black person in the federal government who was related to a civil rights leader. My uncle Roy Wilkins was the head of the NAACP, and because of that, the confluence of my throbbing interest in what was going on in the South and my relationship to my uncle, my whole federal government career got changed. It got changed in the first part because the Kennedy administration felt pressured by this movement that they didn't understand. I have warm memories of President Kennedy. My eyes can mist up on November 23rd, like as I remember, as anybody else's can. But I have to say the Kennedys did not originally understand the civil rights movement and its importance. They thought it was a political problem that they had to handle. Black people felt that it was a crusade, a moral crusade for the redemption of American values, original American values. But the Kennedys sought me out, or sent their minions to seek me out while Birmingham was going on. And they would not seek me out, have formal meetings. They would seek me out at parties. And they'd take me in the corner and they would say, coded message for, we want Roy Wilkins to take over this movement and Martin Luther King to sit down. And so they would say, you know, your uncle is the one we really know and respect. And that was my signal to go and see my uncle and tell him that if he tried to take the NAACP into Birmingham, take over, it would be received very well and supported by the Kennedy administration. And I said, I can't do that. And I never did that. I never went to my uncle and delivered those messages. But I understood what those messages meant. And I understood that the Kennedys wanted an easy way out. They also said to me, you know, Martin is making a big mistake using those kids in Birmingham. And my answer was, he's not making any big mistake. This is an educational opportunity for those kids. And as they march on the street, as they bend Birmingham, they're learning what it is to be a citizen of the United States and to influence policy. So the opportunity that Dr. King and his associates are giving these kids is much more valuable than anything they could be learning in those rotten segregated schools to which they are consigned in Birmingham. And so they stopped saying that to me. And they, as a matter of fact, they stopped coming to me with these messages for my uncle. But I tell you those stories to tell you that if you have a movement, and your movement is strong enough so that people are hearing you around the country, you can be assured that even when the government acts like it's not listening to you, it in fact is listening to you and reacting, even when it's trying to stick its hands in there and change the leadership. Now, Bob started out by saying, talking about the dust-up that happened in this campaign between Senator Clinton's forces and people who were skeptical of some of her messages. There is no way. I was in the government from 62 to 69. There is no way that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have been drafted, the drafting completed in the fall of '63, and be sent up in the fall of '63, lying there after the president's death for President Johnson to use the president's death as a rallying cry to pass that legislation. There is no way that that would have occurred. Senator Clinton said, well, you can make all the great speeches in the world, but it takes a president to pass a law. The fact is that the March on Washington was a huge element in making that bill come into being. And it did it in two ways. The first was that Washington was scared to death. Official Washington was scared to death about the busloads of Negroes coming in here and taking over our city. As a matter of fact, most of the Southern senators told their pretty little white secretaries, don't come to work today. Stay home and lock your door. That's the truth. Several young women whom I knew who worked on the Hill told me that they had been told that. A friend of mine who worked in the White House, I asked him, well, what are you going to be doing on the day of the march? He said, I'm going to be in my office right where I belong, hiding under my desk. So in fact, the vision of 275,000 people coming onto that mall dignified, in a good mood, like a church picnic, and responding beautifully and wonderfully. That changed President Kennedy's mind. He had decided he wasn't going to see these leaders after the march. They had asked to come see him. He said, no, we're not going to see them. Then he saw the march on television, how dignified it was, how controlled it was. He said to the leaders, come on over. The leaders went on over and pressed him to send the bill up. Ultimately, the Republican leader in the Senate. And the second thing, Senator Clinton says, oh, you know, all this high-toned oratory, that doesn't do anything. You tell me that Dr. King's speech on that day didn't do anything. So we got the bill. President, and Edward McKinley Dirksen, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, said, this is an idea whose time has come. Well, what do that mean, its time has come? That some celestial clock said it was time? No, it was because the American people were beginning to demand that this bill be drafted and be put before the Congress and for the Congress to vote on it. Everett Dirksen was saying that his constituents in Illinois had heard the call of the people from Birmingham, heard the call of the people from the mall, and were insisting that he do something about civil rights. That's why the bill had come of time. So it means that action by people in the streets does, on some occasions, make real changes. Finally and briefly, I will say that the difference between Kennedy and Johnson on civil rights was just astonishing. Johnson knew poverty. He cared about poverty. He knew Hispanics, poor ones. He knew poor blacks. He had grown up knowing those things. And so pushing on Johnson was often like pushing on a half-open door. And so from outside, Reverend Jackson, Dr. King, and the others in the movement pushed. And from the inside, we pushed and shaped. One of the greatest compliments I've ever had in my life is that Dr. King once described my agency in the government as the wing of the civil rights movement inside the government. When I heard he said that, I called him up and said, "Thank you, Martin, that's really nice." I like that a lot. And so 40 years later, I still remember it. The final thing was the Poor People's Campaign. We've got to figure out a way to have another Poor People's Campaign in this country. The campaign really never got off the ground because Dr. King had been murdered. SCLC was in mourning. The rest of us were wandering around in the fog. But there is one final thing that I will say to you about the interaction of the government and the people. The one leader of the Poor People's Campaign who really wasn't, he was in grief, but he wasn't immobilized by his grief, was Reverend Jackson, who got the terrific idea of taking the poor people from the encampment down on the mall into federal government cafeterias at lunchtime and saying, "These are poor, hungry people. Feed these people." Hanging around with Reverend Jackson can be dangerous. So, and he did it, and he did it, and did it, and all of a sudden it became clear that the government wasn't, the president had wound down, he was really tired, he was grumpy, the war was going badly, the polls were against him, the people were marching against him. But he kept this up, going and insisting that poor people needed food. So we responded. Essentially, the Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, and I responded, and we started pushing inside the government. The food stamps weren't really a program yet. Let's have free food stamps for people who make less than $1 a day. This is in answer to Reverend Jackson's call. And we battered it and battered it and battered it through the government. And there were lots of people who weren't on our side. There were few. Notably, Sergeant Shriver, who headed the poverty program, supported us. We got it into the White House. Joe Califano, the domestic policy advisor to the president, liked the idea. He took it to the president. The president liked the idea. He called. You didn't know you made all this trouble, did you? The president called Wilbur Mills, who represented Wilbur Mills of Arkansas, who was then the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he said, "I got this great idea." I said, "It's his idea now, not his idea, not my idea." And he said, "Poor people, $1 a day, free food stamps." Mills stopped it in its tracks. He said, "Lyndon," he said, "I just got you $100 million for your war. I don't have any more money up here for anything for you. We're not going to do that." So I end this by saying, do not think that wars carried out a long way from here are not having a devastating impact on our lives in this country. And I would say finally, as a personal word, since Reverend Jackson is the person here who was in the civil rights movement a leader, that I stand before you now, a man of almost 76 years, and say to the whole leadership of the civil rights movement, but to Jesse, my friend, as an individual, You all changed the country. You all changed the lives of lots of poor people. And you changed my life. And I thank you.
Well, that's very hard to follow. Both of them. I want to second some of those messages and try to add a couple of historical points to enrich the challenge that's before all of us. Citizens' movements are not just vital. I agree with both of them. They are indispensable for change in America. One minor moment when that really hit home to me was once I was interviewing Diane Nash. Some of you may know Diane Nash from SNCC, from the early civil rights movement. She was a very forceful influence and innovator in the sit-ins and the freedom rides and a number of other critical, and in Selma and in Birmingham, on and on. I was interviewing her once about the FBI because they had wiretapped her and done some bad things to her or her family and around her. And she shrugged and she says, "Oh, Hoover was our fault." And it stunned me. I said, "Diane, what did you have to do with Hoover?" She said, "I'm a citizen of the United States. We left a person in a position of secret power and influence for 50 years. We got exactly what we deserved, and anybody who studied what American government is about should know that." So here is a woman who is a victim who still sees herself saying, if I am a piece of a country where we all own an equal share of responsibility, the first thing you've got to do is act like it. Remarkable example of the responsibility and the initiative that people had in the movement to win the right to vote for others when they couldn't vote themselves, to design a plan. She designed a plan that became Selma on the night of the Birmingham church bombing because she had felt responsible for the church bombing, having been involved in the children's demonstrations in Birmingham. Most of us would complain and say it was somebody else's fault and they'll never do anything about it, or we need a new president, or we need a new attorney general, or we need a new law. She said, it's up to us to have a plan by morning. And she took it and nagged Dr. King until he went to Selma. Her husband, Bevel, said that Diane got on you the way the leeches got on Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen. And that's what a citizens movement is. Like Jesse said, make me do it, quoting Franklin Roosevelt. At Selma, just a historical moment about the relationship. When the Selma Bridge happened on March 7th, Dr. King that night called for people all over America to come and march. Not in a month, but 2 days later. In that 2 days, you see what we're talking about here, about the relationship between a movement and the government. The whole Selma movement was a petition to the government, just like the whole movement was. We will live out our dream, the meaning of the American Creed, through the American government, and we're petitioning it to happen. Johnson sent John Doerr, one of the great public servants, to get Dr. King to wait. He had a federal judge order Dr. King to wait. He had legislators from the Senate and the House say, we'll get a bill if you will wait. King is involved, and the movement people right there in Sullivan Jackson's house in Selma, with all three branches of the United States government at once, over whether they're going to wait or not. They had the famous turnaround march, where they went halfway on March 9th, okay? Now that is a critical moment in history, because there were a lot of people who said Dr. King sold out, never trusted him again after that moment. Some of those same people were saying the Voting Rights Act, and these are people who had gone to jail and lived and died for the movement, the Voting Rights Act can't be good if the federal government's involved with it. There were people who in the movement who were against the Voting Rights Act, because if the government is in it, it can't be good. Dr. King is trying to hold together this movement and deal with all three branches of government in front of the whole world. All of those elements are important. The law is important. The movement is important. And how all of these things come together are important because, as Jesse said, they changed history. They changed history far more broadly than we give credit for today. They changed the white South. They changed, as he said, sports. You never heard of the Sun Belt when it was segregated. It enriched white people in the South. I am blessed, like Roger, by the Civil Rights Movement, but that's not part of the history we inherit. And that is the same reason that the flap over the movement that we've had now didn't go anywhere except in spitballs over who had insulted whom. That's because the watchword of politics then was movement, something that will change history and move the world through a law and a citizens movement. The watchword in politics now is spin. Spin is going around and round and not moving anywhere. All politics is for is the entertainment and of people sitting at home like consumers, watching reporters who are like sportscasters, who are sneering and throwing spitballs at each other. The citizens movement has to change the culture from a spin culture to a movement culture by being in ferment over the relationship. First, you got to create a citizens movement and then respectfully understand all of the relationships that go on between that movement and the government, and to try to bring about this change. There were people in the movement who had been working through the courts forever. There were people in the movement who were working through the legislature, through the streets, through the presidency, and all of those ways. So I second Jesse's recommendation, not only that we need the movement, but we have to lay claim to the benefits of history that the movement brought. And we have to argue and recognize that some of that is our fault. How can it be that these magnificent changes that there have been 2,000 years of rabbinic Judaism, but it had always been a joke to have a female rabbi until the civil rights movement put the notion of equal souls and equal votes in people's mind, and now that's a commonplace. Things came out of that we haven't even laid claim to, and yet the dominant idea in politics ever since then is that government is bad. And that liberal is a dirty word. Now, why have we not been able to lay claim to that history? And I submit that there are some painful rules, painful realities there. Number one, we didn't lay claim to it because we were exhausted and tired, and because the government that finally recognized this movement was the same one that went straight to Vietnam. So we were all caught up in ferment over that, and people were tired. Number two, the country as a whole is still racially driven and is not ready to recognize that a movement led by African Americans fundamentally redeemed America across the board. And so we are still not ready to see Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson in the same mantle with Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson as people who confronted hierarchy and created freedom, set in motion equal citizenship. And until we see the movement people as founders, then we're going to try to diminish it and say, well, that was about then, and it proved that government ran off the rails and that it was just a time when people were running around smoking pot. And that's the image that people have. So we are out of joint with our time. We have to lay claim to our history. And another reason that we don't do it, quite frankly, is because there are some people in a wounded and unrecognized movement who are afraid that if you lay claim to the full breadth of its benefit to the world, from South Africa to Tiananmen Square and all the way over to Lech Walesa, where they're singing "We Shall Overcome" when the Berlin Wall came down, we should be laying claim to that as the fruit of hope and victory of a movement. And to some degree, we're not doing it because it diminishes the role of it as a movement strictly by and for blacks. So it's menaced on both sides. It's by the racism of the country that doesn't want to recognize a black-led movement, and by the wounds of a black-led movement that wants to hang on to something small that it has. So there are a lot of lessons here. Lay claim to it, recognize the movement, and the last thing I'll say is if you want to hear Dr. King and Lyndon Johnson talk about Selma, you can call the LBJ Library and get a phone call where they discuss this somewhat after, and the Vietnam War is just happening. And it is an amazing subtext conversation, because Johnson said, okay, I wanted the Voting Rights Act, but I wanted it in about 5 years. I didn't want it then. I told you not to do it. He said, I believe that it was right. I wish the Brown decision had been about voting, because it would have been a better basis. That's what Johnson said to King. And I didn't want you to do it because I thought we needed to digest the Civil Rights Act of '64. But when you made me do it, when you went down there and brought all those people into Selma and all those nuns and all those preachers and everybody who came, talk radio came out of Selma. All kinds of things came out of Selma. The nuns went back to KMOX and were on the radio for 24 straight hours about what it was like that American nuns were down there. But Johnson says to King, you made me do it. And you allowed me to go before the well of the Congress and say, we shall overcome. That's what government is about. That's the best thing that ever happened. And King is interacting with him, and in 30 seconds they're talking about Vietnam, and their estrangement begins. But the last thing I want to say about that, Dr. King, nobody doubts the fervor of Dr. King's commitment against the Vietnam War. But you can also listen on the FBI wiretaps or read the FBI wiretaps shortly before he was killed. He said, I have opposed this war. I want to have the Poor People's Campaign, but I have never called Lyndon Johnson's name by name in denouncing the Vietnam War. This war is our war. It's our country. We're responsible for it. We're going to do what we can to end it. We will denounce it with all the fervor we have. We will give our lives to stop it. But we're not going to demonize people while we're doing it. It's another way of saying don't get involved and don't get caught up in the spin. We got to get caught up in where we're going and not demonizing people, and that's the way the movement can be most productive. Thank you.
Oh, I want to pick up on 2 points that you made, Taylor, and while denying all the stuff that Roger Wilkins said about me. After Dr. King was killed and we came to Washington anyhow, and the government turned its back on us, and we didn't have the power to make anything happen. At some point, out of that battle cry emerged, I am somebody, a way of using some hope to overcome the sense of awesome rejection. And one day we marched to the Department of Agriculture, and we ate. And then they say, collect the money. We say, but you're in our debt list. I'm trying to calculate what you owe us plus what we owe you. And so they said, it doesn't work that way. They said, well, you owe us and we owe you. I just want to deal with the balance sheet. We almost went to jail legitimately on that particular argument. But the land claim, the 2 points here. One, the idea of running from the word liberal. America is a liberal idea. The idea of America is liberal. The idea of the land where people can come and in a generation change languages and go from poverty to president. This idea of give me your tithe, your poor, your whole masses on the invitation. The idea of universal education and equal opportunity, equal protection under the law. The idea that there is no royal blood, that all blood is royal and everybody is and can be somebody. America is a liberal idea. In contrast, you can only become king if you were born a prince, you become king because your daddy was. That is a conservative idea, that you are born forever a serf, and you can never rise to high heights. You can never go from being a blind kid in Harlem becoming governor of New York. It's a liberal idea. And so it is that we must lay claim to the liberal and not run from that tradition. The second, because I just want to expand upon it before kicking it back, is that every time I go to Selma, this was the 43rd anniversary Sunday a week ago, there's almost all blacks. It has been dismissed as the blacks movement for the right to vote. First of all, in that struggle, Swerna Goodman and Cheney and 2 Jews and a black were killed. Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed in Prairie County, which triggered the march. The African American was killed. Reverend James Reed, a white Unitarian minister in Boston, was killed. Medgar Evers was killed. We shared and shed common blood for our right to vote. Selma belongs to all of us. And the part about it that limits our movement is that the benefits of Selma cannot be locked into Selma. I repeat again, 65 blacks got the right to vote, the state's right to vote, I might add, the first time since Reconstruction. But out of that came the 18-year-olds. The argument was that we're old enough to fight in Vietnam, we're old enough to vote. And so all the students who can now vote 18 and older, that Selma belongs to you too. Students in Mississippi filed a lawsuit for residential on campus voting. We won that battle. And so the fact you can go to school and vote where you go to school, that's Selma too. The Latinos can vote en masse, and Eastern Europeans and Native Americans, that's Selma too. The 1990 Fist of Disabilities. So in many ways, we must lay claim to our victories, and even when the right wing reacts to us and puts on the Supreme Court a woman, that was our argument too. Y'all follow what I'm saying? They react, so we'll have, if a black president, we'll have a black Secretary of State. Good. That's us too. The right wing is reacting to our, even as it becomes more inclusive and more expansive, that is the success and fruits of our movement. We're not going backwards toward they're seeing America out of through a keyhole. We're going to America, we see America out of a door. The keyhole America is their democracy. The open door democracy is ours, and we're winning here. South Africa, we are winning through all the odds. We're winning our struggle here and around the world.
I want to try to get you to respond to a kind of more focused question, which is, we're headed into a Congress and hopefully a president where there's commitments to end the war and a lot of pressure not to end the war. And you got a movement that very much wants to bring this war to an end for obvious reasons. When King was in that position with Johnson, I'm interested in the pressures that Johnson put on King to, as Taylor said, to not yet, right, put this off, and how King related to that, and whether King thought, how he responded to the notion that you're endangering us. You've got an ally in the White House. I'm trying to do what I can do. If you keep pushing, you're going to, erode me politically, and you're going to lose an ally. We're going to hear, after we have increased majorities, I hope at the end of this next election, we're going to hear the leadership say to us, don't expect too much because the Republicans will win in 2 years if we start to fight among ourselves. So don't keep causing trouble. Just stay in line, and we'll do what we can do, and trust us. And I'm certain that Johnson and King were having that exchange, both directly and indirectly. And I'd be interested in your sense of, each of your senses of how King dealt with this tension about pushing an ally, even though he's getting pushed back, that you're gonna endanger us.
Well, this is a big story because it went on for some time. The first big troop, Selma and the beginning of the Vietnam War happened literally simultaneously. The first Marine units landed within hours of Bloody Sunday. The first major troop commitment was in end of July, right before Watts and right before the Voting Rights Act was passed. Just days. So these were happening at the same time. The first thing that happened when Johnson came out on the King hard was Johnson asked King to go up to New York and meet with Arthur Goldberg, who was the UN secretary, ambassador there. And Goldberg was a well-known liberal civil rights lawyer, and essentially he convinced Dr. King that they had a plan to end the war. And Dr. King later apologized for essentially falling back because he had criticized the war in the summer of '65 publicly. That's what had the subtext in this call between King and Johnson when they're talking about the Voting Rights Act on one hand and they're talking about the Vietnam War underneath. And he did pull back. He later apologized, and then all of these pressures came. And of course, when he came out against the Vietnam War formally and finally and completely at Riverside Church in '67, the whole world came down on him, including the Times and the Post and all the respectable patronizing establishment was against him. So it was quite difficult. I would say, other than what I've already said about how for him it was important to try to, this may be the most controversial thing. I think Dr. King did not see Lyndon Johnson as inherently a warmonger. I think he thought that Johnson would have given anything to get out of the war except being called a coward. What Dr. King said was that Lyndon Johnson was afraid not to be violent if it was going to cost him power, and that he couldn't do that and corrupted the whole world and gave us this war. The thing that he found that was hard when he's denouncing the war and saying to end it was, how do we end it? And I think that that is a lesson and a legacy for us today. Don't avoid the question of our responsibility of suggesting ways out. One of the things that Johnson said to King in Vietnam conversations is none of the liberals on Vietnam is actually saying withdraw today. Bobby Kennedy never said that. Everybody said let's negotiate, and Johnson said that's fool's gold. You're saying essentially that there's a cheap way out of Vietnam where we're not going to get blamed for losing. And I know the reality of politics, the same people who are saying to negotiate, if I lose the war and get out, they'll jump on me for losing the war. So we didn't really step up and say, how do we end this war now? How do we do it in the best possible way? And I do think that that is a warning for us today, not to pretend that there's an easy way to end the war and yet make a tension with that you have to end the war. We have to end the war, and we have to, but we can't pretend that it's going to be easy. And there's got to be a good way. I've always said that in my best world, some leader would have the courage to go to the United Nations and say, we messed up. We made an error here. We took this on. We're looking for the most responsible way to end our role. Will you help us do it? Will you talk to us about doing it? What is the best way for Iraq for us to end this war? We're going to end the war, but we want to do it responsibly, and we want to begin by acknowledging that we did wrong. I don't know whether that's a possibility, but it's just one.
Roger, you want to get it?
The only thing I'd say to that is that sometimes you you are Taylor Branch, right? Very often people are skeptical about how much their protest actions are affecting the people who run the country. Now, I would say it is probably true that it is very hard to get into George Bush's head. But we're talking about real people here, so. And I would say that never underestimate how much they are looking at you and listening to you, even though they're pretending that they're not. And one of the seminal experiences on that I had was that one day I was in a meeting in the White House in the cabinet room. Now, I wasn't sitting at the cabinet table. I want to give you that idea. But you see those pictures, you know, of the people in the cabinet room, and you see the big dog sitting at the table, and then you see some little tiny dogs sitting by the back wall. Well, I was a little tiny dog back by the back wall, but the president was in a foul mood. He was just in a foul mood, and we're supposed to be talking about civil rights, but he couldn't not talk about the war, and he would just, his mind would veer off. I saw this on a number of occasions where he'd start talking about one thing, and then he'd end up talking about the war because it was eating him up. But he sat there and he said, you know what these demonstrators are doing? They're out there on Pennsylvania Avenue, and they're yelling, and they hollering, and they're making all this noise, and they woke up my little daughter Lucy last night. I'm telling you, they hear it. They feel it as human beings. And you should never, never say, oh, it doesn't matter if I go to that march or not, or it doesn't matter whether I do this or that. They listen. They hear. They may not react, but it weighs on them. It weighs on them in a way that your silence not only makes it easier for them, but they conclude that your silence is acquiescence, and you should never let that happen.
I think what further complicates it, Bob and panelists, Dr. King was philosopher King. He was both prophet and politician. He was not disconnected from the prophetic urgency of now and the process of political change. So what he called, you know, Hegel's synthesis, that thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He embodied that in a very fundamental way. In 1964, Dr. King campaigned vigorously for Lyndon Johnson because he knew the alternative was Barry Goldwater. So that's why early on, when the kind of soundbite spin took off on Hillary on the question of diminishing Dr. King to support Lyndon Johnson's position, that was just soundbite stuff, because it took a combination of the litigation led by the Thurgood Marshalls, the Constance Baker Motley, and the Joe Rouse and Jack Greenberg. It took the litigation and the demonstration and the legislation. It took all three to make this thing happen. And Dr. King had, again, that broad view. The other is that Dr. King, as Taylor suggests, one time started down this road of attacking this war and stopped to reconsider, because he knew the weight of taking the country on in a popular war and your patriotism being challenged. Guys like Julian Bond did not stop. Julian won his Senate seat and was not seated in the Georgia state legislature. That was that tension between, if you will, younger and older, as in 23 and 30. But the sense that the students kept pressing the anti-war question. And then Dr. King finally gave that April 4th, 67 speech, and gave his 7 reasons why he was against the war in Vietnam. And he said ultimately that there were such high hopes for the war on poverty, and that budget was being diminished for the war in Vietnam. Exactly what's happening today between covering up the mistake in Iraq and building out Bear Stearns. There's the money left for health care, housing, and education today. It's the same basic dilemma. But Dr. King, I saw him up close, internalized the pain. And I remember one night he was giving a speech in Cleveland, and he said, and when I was saying blacks should not fight whites back when they bombed my house in Montgomery, and blacks should not pick up arms, you said I was a good guy. And I urged blacks not to fight back when dogs bit us. I was like a real good guy. But now I'm saying not only should blacks not fight whites and whites should not fight blacks, but none of us should fight each other. I will speak and I will be heard. That sense of defiance and fight back. But he never stopped the agony and the pain. Our last staff meeting before going to Memphis was a period of particular pain, some of which we knew, some we didn't know. He called us to a meeting on a Saturday morning, a hurried meeting some of us did not want to come to. I certainly didn't want to come to it. We all had other assignments at that time. And he said, I sent for you because I've had a migraine headache for 3 days. He said, I've been with Ralph and Juanita and my wife, Coretta, and Andy and Jean, and I feel I'm under attack, not supported by the staff fully. I don't think you understand, and we didn't. Some board members are releasing letters to the press, and they're attacking me. Some former classmates are attacking me. The civil rights leaders are saying I should be focused on domestic issues, not on the war, and they are attacking. And I thought once that I should just quit. That I should quit. We've done an awful lot in 13 years, from the back of the bus to where we are today, from public accommodation, the right to vote, we're about to get open housing. We've done a lot. Maybe I could just become president of Morehouse College and do some teaching and some writing and some traveling. I thought about quitting. They said I thought maybe that I would fast and pray. That many of those with whom we disagree tactically, Stokely and Rapp and others would come by my bedside, Roy Wilkins, Whitney, John Lewis, and though we may disagree tactically, they would embrace me, and we could reunite our movement. Then he said, well, we got to turn the minus into a plus as we did in Albany, we got to move on. It was like he preached himself out of a depression, but he was in a deep depression. And I had to parallel it with Jesus saying, A, let this cup pass from me. And B, as he fasted, disciples slept, and then said, not my will be done. He went through great agony about that war. So Bob, it was not like a simple decision for him. It was very painful, very private. I heard what I just said, he said, but we did not know the level of pressure upon him by the government. The threats, the wiretapping, the attempt to disrupt, discredit, destroy, much of that pain he internalized. Some things you just can't quite say. It became more apparent to us after the fact, Taylor, some levels of the depth of his pain, but he was almost like the guy at the vortex, the road between go and don't go. And he finally decided that to not betray his conscience, we had to go to fight the war, even if it meant death. That's why he was rational with death. Even in the sermon in Memphis that night, if death be my lot, I've been in the mountaintop, but I am not going back. That was a big kind of breakthrough emotion, his confrontation face to face with death, and he didn't blink.
All right, gentlemen, I want to give you just a minute. This is a gathering of progressive activists and leaders from across the country. They are carrying this debate through this election year and beyond. Last words of wisdom that you can offer them about, from reflecting on the King years, about that should inform their course. Do I have a volunteer?
The only thing I would say at the beginning is next year is going to come. A lot of people I can't even turn on the cable news anymore. But they're acting like it's not going to come, or that disaster will be assured by nightfall. Disaster will only be assured by nightfall if we get hypnotized by all of that. It's going to come, it's going to be vitally important, and the really important thing to me is how many citizens' movements and coalitions are addressing and ready to move on how many issues, and there are a lot of them. They're not just simple ones. The people we have in our prisons, our crumbling infrastructure, this war and finding a responsible, if somebody is saying, I'm struggling with how to get out of the war, there's a natural temptation to say that means this person is not determined to get out of the war. But fight that. Try to make sure that they're determined to get out of the war, but respect the notion that it's not easy and that there might be, we need all the brain power we can get to end the war, to redirect those priorities. But above all, I think that this all matters. It's not about just who wins, it's about the everyday lives of people all around the world from now forward. That's when Jesse was talking about how the movement changed, how broadly the movement changed history. We lose track of that when we're laying claim to it. We're not laying claim to abstract marks in a history book. We're talking about the reality that people wake up to in their everyday lives. The movement ended terror, literally. Terrorism, Klan terror, and what segregation meant. And it affects the everyday lives. Another martyr in Selma, Viola Liuzzo, the trial, and Jonathan Daniels, too, right after Selma. Out of that came something that really struck me. It was illegal in Alabama then for women of any race to serve on juries of any kind throughout the state of Alabama by state law. There were no black people on juries by custom and racism. There were no women on juries by law. The movement ended that too. People wake up every day in Alabama taking it for granted that women now serve on juries just like every other citizen. We have to be prepared to fight for that kind of reality and change across the board, from poverty and the war in Iraq and our environment and our infrastructure and our crumbling schools. All across the board. That's what's at stake. So bless you all and good luck.
I would just like to thank you for being who you are and for what you do. I have taught for 20 years, and much of what I taught was, I read the books and I taught the books, but basically what I taught was me and the lessons that I learned and being an American citizen. And what I learned is that change can come, but only if Americans take seriously their citizenship in this country. You've got to be an active participant in the country. I tell my students, they tell you that the only things that are certain are death and taxes. I said, that's a lie. The only things certain are death, taxes, and change. And the fact is that things are going to change. You know that. We don't, they were driving Model T Fords when I was a little boy. Now they got stuff called, the Focus and the Prius and all that stuff. And and when I was a little boy, my father was a journalist and he typed on a typewriter. Now they have computers that completely bumfoozle me, but I use them anyway. There is change. There's going to be change. I was born in a segregated hospital. My first educational experience was in a one-room segregated schoolhouse in Kansas City. We don't much do that anymore. And we don't do it because people like these went out and make change. And it seems to me that as I've watched older relatives of mine die, I have realized that the thing you don't want to do is to lead a life which ends with you on your deathbed saying, "Oh, hell, I wish I had done duh. Today is the day to do duh. And tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow." And don't worry that it's not bringing instant results, because you're influencing lots of people who are going to come after you. Have faith in yourselves. Have faith in the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution of the United States, and your own guts and brains, and we'll be a better country. Thank you.
One of my concerns, back to Taylor's point of claiming our victories, if we claim them and put them in perspective, then that means more of us will embrace them and appreciate the impact. In '84, when I ran the first time, I remember Jim Hightower saying, he endorsed me in the pool of the state capitol in Texas, that we would have been sitting around talking about the progressive movement and what would need to happen. I just didn't think it would be led by a black. This is a way of overcoming the cultural wall. Wherever it comes from, it comes. If we who are here, who are writers and thinkers and doers, if we just connected, you just mentioned the women as jurors from Alabama, they would never associate that victory with Dr. King and our march. Like students do not associate their right to vote in residency with our march in Selma, or the physically disabled. I was reading what someone said in Texas, I'm going to vote for Hillary and not for Barack because when blacks had the numbers, they did nothing for us. But she was not a hostile. She just didn't understand. She was on the way to vote in Spanish because of the Voting Rights Act in Selma. So we have some need to further expand the base of knowledge among our own families, the real point I'm trying to make. The other point is Dr. King's the unfinished business. When he gave the march and the speech in Washington that day, it really was not the dream speech, I must say. He never quite saw it. The dream was the alliterative, poetic climax. It really was the broken promise speech. He had the climax. He could have climaxed one of his favorite songs, Never Alone. He chose to use the dream that day. He said, we stand in your shadows, Lincoln, and you promised 100 years ago Emancipation Proclamation. We got the proclamation without emancipation. Congress, you promised the 13th Amendment, and today from Texas across to Florida up to Maryland, we can't use a single public toilet. We can't vote. You promised. So we have this balance check marked insufficient fund. That was a kind of metaphorical transition, but the speech really was about the promise. And it's easy to talk about the dream, because the dream does not carry with it a budget. But honoring the promise carries with it a budget obligation. So his last agenda was, we must reinvest in America's infrastructure and put America back to work. That is his unfinished business. And so while many of us are judged this season by Barack's outstanding candidacy and that of Hillary, I would urge you not just to look at that spectacular race, but look at the Kerner report 40 years later. Because that's not anecdotal. That is the structural disparity. And this, no matter who wins, the Kerner report is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. I thought one of the great missed moments led by journalists setting the agenda when Brian Williams and Rusted did the debate with the two of them in Cleveland. The whole world watching in China and Jamaica and Australia and all that. At Cleveland State, as a backdrop, and never mentioned student loans or student debt one time. And Cleveland State never mentioned killings on campuses at Virginia Tech and NIU, for the weapons that came to kill the kids at Virginia Tech and NIU came from the same gun shop. At Cleveland State, and they never mentioned urban policy one time. They never mentioned that night. I'm talking about the journalists who set the question. They never mentioned home foreclosures. One time, they never mentioned the word poverty. One time. They never mentioned Appalachia, where the coal miners and the chemical workers and the steel workers work, and the hardest working poor people in America. They never mentioned it one time. So while some want to focus on the horse race, I'm interested in who's in the wagon and who ain't on the wagon. Because the horse race is fascinating, but any academic on TV monitoring, because while there's a third rail called activism, there's a fourth rail called press. And the impact of these spinners on TV setting the agenda is overwhelming. What was the big deal to me about Imus was not just what Imus said, which was unacceptable, but the power he had. Imus was on MSNBC 750 hours a year, and on CBS Radio 1,040 hours a year. All the blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in America combined didn't have the access of one Imus alone. And you turn that TV on every day, whether it is Joe Scarborough in the morning or whether it is whomever in the afternoon or around at night, this awesome fourth estate power of spinners setting the agenda. And lastly, there's been a lot of talk this year about hope ain't enough. Don't ever underestimate just the power of hope, because it has lifting power. In 1960, Kennedy beat Nixon by 112,000 votes, less than 1 vote per precinct, because that was this awesome hope. And John Kennedy reached out to Dr. King in jail, and Nixon did not. Dr. King's father shifted parties from Lincoln Republican to Democrat, and by that thin margin, by the margin of hope, we won. In 68, Dr. King killed, Robert Kennedy killed, convention train wreck in Chicago, and by the margin of despair, Nixon won by 500,000 votes. By the margin of hope, we won, and by the margin of despair, we lost. In Florida, by the margin of not fighting back when we had the victory, we lost. And so in 2008, we have the numbers, and we have the cause, and we have the will, and don't let no diversion break our spirit about who is supporting whom. This campaign is not about surrogates, it's about candidates. Let's keep our hope alive. Thank you.
Taylor Branch, Roger Wilkins, Jesse Jackson. Let's give them a big hand.